We're also recording. Okay, so I think we're ready now to start. Thank you everyone for waiting. I'm Professor David Bilchertz, Director of SAIFAC, which is the Centre of the University of Johannesburg, and I'm going to hand over to Dr. Mispa Roux, who's the head of the Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Unit in SAIFAC, who will chair this discussion. Over to you, Mispa.
Thank you so much, David, and welcome to everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. This is our first webinar with my unit this year, so I'm very glad to be hosting it shortly before Women's Day, National Women's Day in our country. And thank you so much also for our panelists. So before I introduce them, I would just like to also ask Nancy if you could, Nancy from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, to give us just a brief overview of what you do. The Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, in case you don't know, they've sponsored and collaborated with us on a number of occasions, and I'm especially grateful for Konrad Adenauer South Africa that you put me into contact with the Rule of Law program, also Konrad Adenauer, because we've collaborated with them quite nicely in the past. So over to you, Nancy.
Thank you, Mispa. Good afternoon, everyone, especially to our esteemed speakers, our facilitator, Mispa, and everyone who's joining this important seminar. I welcome you on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation to discuss this critical topic of COVID-19 and gender-based violence. So the foundation funds programs on the promotion of democracy, strengthening of good governance, as well as the rule of law. Gender-based violence is a global phenomenon which affects 1 in 3 women in their lifetime. It is appropriate to have this seminar during Women's Month, when we pay tribute to the more than 20,000 women who marched to the Union buildings on the 9th of August 1956 in protest against the extension of past laws to women. Nevertheless, this year we commemorate Women's Month under peculiar circumstances of COVID-19 and the lockdown. We do so with heavy hearts as a result of the continued attack of women by their intimate partners, family members, and men they don't know. For many families, this lockdown provided an opportunity to spend rare quality time because frankly, there's nothing much happening out there. However, for some women, the lockdown feels like a never-ending nightmare as they're under lockdown with abusive partners and in a hostile society. In Africa, gender-based violence pervades the political, economic, and social structures of society. It is driven by strong patriarchal norms. We often hear that the statistics of violence in South Africa are similar to countries at war. Police records an average of 116 rapes and 58 murders every day. Recently, the Minister of Police released the 2019-2020 crime stats. There has been an increase of 1.7% in sexual violence cases. And we all know that some victims of gender-based violence are afraid to report cases. They suffer in silence and continue to be victimized. Some are ashamed to report cases of gender-based violence because of the treatment they receive from the police. Others are pressurized by their families. They face backlash when they want to report cases. President Ramaphosa labeled gender-based violence as a second pandemic. All of us in South Africa, we are in the midst of the devastating effects of COVID-19, but women are facing a second pandemic of gender-based violence. Women are not safe. Students at institutions of higher learning are attacked by men at campuses or in the vicinity of their campuses. Many of them do not report the cases for fear of victimization because sometimes the perpetrators are their lecturers. Gender-based violence is a complex issue, requiring multifaceted responses and commitment from all stakeholders, including government, civil society, universities, and society as a whole. Let me take this opportunity to thank David, Mispa, and Naomi, and the team at SAIFAC for this cooperation. I'm looking forward to the presentations from our speakers and active engagement from everyone. I thank you. Over to you, Mispa.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was that was spot on, exactly you took the words out of my mouth, actually. And that's exactly why we've thought we want to host the webinar on this topic, because of the ever increasing gender-based violence as a result of the pandemic. And it's alarming that now, because of all the stress that everyone is going through, that it has just alarmingly increased. So the questions that we thought of is also and that's also why we have our panelists, Professor Surya Deva from the University of Hong Kong, and Professor Bonnie Meyersfeld from the University of Witwatersrand, and basically the establisher of, or the founding member of, the Lawyers Against Abuse. And that's why we wanted them here, so that they can also put their heads together to try and establish what is the role of business when it comes to gender-based violence, and the risk that employees have with now working from home. What can employers do? What is the role of business in this regard? And then also, because we are linked at a university, and it's our SAIFAC, as well as Lawyers Against Human Rights, University of Witwatersrand, we were thinking, what role can a university play when it comes to their students and the increased risks that their students have? Because before lockdown, it was a type of a controlled environment where people go to work and they at the office for a certain amount of time. Our students are on campus, we see them, we interact with them, there's certain protection that we can provide. But now all of that has been taken away. So what are the different responsibilities? Are there responsibilities? How do you enforce that? So just to also explain to you before we go into the panelists, when I give them an opportunity to speak, they will each get roughly 15-20 minutes to talk. Of course, if they want to go less than that, I'm not going to kick them off. And then after that, we will have a Q&A session, and then just some concluding remarks. Now, if you do have any questions, please post them in the chat box or in the chat room. Otherwise, you can just put your name there if you want to talk, and I can unmute you. So, Professor Surya, if you can start, and then afterwards we'll give Bonnie an opportunity, and then we will open up the room for Q&A. So, Professor Surya, looking forward to what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mispa. And let me start by thanking David and all the colleagues, Nancy, and all the team organizing this webinar, which is very, very timely, because this is an important issue, not just for South Africa or India or China or any particular country, but globally. We are looking at the reports coming out from almost everywhere that the women are facing, in particular, women and girls are facing in particular gender-based violence because of COVID. But of course, when we talk about gender-based violence, it need not be only women or girls facing this violence. It could be even men. But I think in my presentation, I'm mostly going to focus on the dimension of women and girls, though it does not exclude dimension of men or LGBTI people facing those kind of violence. So let me start with a brief context. And the context is that whenever we have a crisis, whenever we have a conflict, whenever we have an emergency, which is a natural or man-made, it has been very well documented that women are impacted quite differently in those particular situations. And there is also this element of intersectionality. And the intersectional impact is in those particular situations where women may be of color, they could be suffering from some kind of disability, they could be women who are working in the rural community, or they could be homosexual orientation or some other sexual orientation issue. So that intersectionality element is quite relevant, and that the impact is felt by women and girls very, very differently. So that is not unique to, I think that is not unique to COVID. So that is my starting point, that you have those situations whenever we have those emergency or the crisis situation, the impact. I don't know, because anyway, I will proceed. Now, in terms of COVID and human rights, I think COVID has impacted almost every single human right. Full range of civil and political rights to economic, social, and cultural rights, and also the collective rights. Of course, the impact sometimes has been positive as well. There has been less environmental pollution, climate change has been paused or limited quite significantly. So I think we can see some positive effects of COVID as well on human rights. But at the same time, I think the impacts which are negative are quite predominant. Now, there are three dimensions in my view, and let us see if Bonnie has a different take on this. In my view, COVID and human rights, there is this relationship. It has three possibilities or three openings. One possibility is that the human rights abuses were already there, and they have been merely exposed by COVID-19. I would put here the wider issues about poverty, economic inequalities, issues about discrimination against women, the power imbalance that we have in society, patriarchy. These things have already been there. And sometimes or digital divide, again, it is already there. But sometimes these things in the normal context have been normalized and kind of ignored or put under the carpet. But the COVID crisis has exposed those adverse impact on certain sections of society. And I think that exposure role is the first dimension in my view. The second possibility, or the second dimension of COVID is that COVID could worsen or make it worse certain abuses or certain things which were there even before. And I would put domestic violence here. Like, domestic violence is not something that COVID has created. It has been there globally, but has been made worse because of the work from home situation or the context of the social distancing norms and all that. And the third possibility potentially could be that the COVID has perhaps created some new impacts or some new kinds of dilemmas. So these are three situations that I would like to start with. And here, a key question that often rises is in terms of health resources. Let us say we have a person who is about to die or who has serious breathing difficulties. And on the other hand, we have a person who has suffered some kind of gender-based violence. So out of these two victims or these two patients who need some kind of medical assistance, who should get the priority? Or if it is about investigation by the police, who should get the priority? Or if it is about the municipal authorities, who should be taking care of those particular issues? So I think there are these newer challenges and dilemmas that COVID has definitely created. Now, in terms of the typology, how could gender-based violence be triggered in the context of COVID? I would refer to 4 situations. These are not exhaustive situations, but I would just highlight 4 situations in which that could take place. One which often is very prominent is the work from home situation. So women and girls, if they are working from home, and this work from home could be broadly under 2 situations. It could be because the government has imposed curfew or social distancing norms, and because of that, businesses have no option but to follow the government rules and regulations. That is one possibility. And the second possibility, work from home possibility, could be that the government, let us say Hong Kong, like in Hong Kong, there has not been so far a complete lockdown, but there has been situations that businesses have still asked some employees to work from home, even if it is not mandatory. So here we can divide this work from home into 2 subcategories. One situation is the involuntary. There's total lockdown and businesses have no option but to ask their employees to work from home. The second possibility is that there is no complete lockdown and businesses have an option. And in that, they exercise their discretion that some workers may work from home and some may not. That is the first scenario in which this gender-based violence may unfold. The second situation is women as the healthcare workers. Throughout the globe, women are quite predominant players in the health sector, especially the support staff supporting doctors. And again, there is a gender bias there, which I will not address, but I think why there are so many women in the, let us say, in the support staff, that also explains and raises those questions. So those women workers may not be allowed to go home because of the risk of infection. So there are possibilities where the hospitals or the government may put these healthcare workers in certain dormitories and certain hotels and all this. And I think that also creates a potential risk of gender-based violence. It could be from the colleagues who are there, because even the male colleagues cannot go home. Or it could be in the settings in which the accommodation has been provided. That may not be adequate or safe, because all the governments may not have enough economic resources to provide safe and adequate accommodation. But at the same time, they would like to provide some temporary accommodation to these workers. The third possibility is the access to healthcare. So whenever there is a possibility of someone is, let us say, suffering from any kind of disease or health issue, and that person would like to seek some medical attention, and that person approaches a hospital, and I think there have been reports, isolated instances where they have been abused in that particular setting, because the hospitals and doctors are predominantly looking at the COVID situation. They're not looking at the other health impairment issues. My fourth and the final situation is if there is a gender-based violence experienced by a woman, a girl, or a man, or anyone for that matter, then the question is that you may need to seek help. The help could be from civil society organizations, the help could be from counselors, the help could be from police, or could be investigation officers, or could be some government officers, or you want to approach national human rights institutions or courts to seek some remedies. And because of the COVID, access to help or justice or remedies has been seriously compromised. And I think that also then makes the situation of the violence worse, because first of all, you're not able to get any attention. And then if you try to seek any help in that process, there could be all those possibilities. Now, in this background, what are the obligations of businesses? And I think the word business can be used in a very broad sense. A question for us to consider is, can universities be considered a business? And in my view, at least universities, at least some of them, are behaving like businesses. And I'm not talking about merely private universities. I'm talking about universities which are publicly funded, but not completely publicly funded. So they may be akin to businesses in certain situations. So I think that is a question, again, we may wish to consider. And again, the issue is also about the responsibility of non-business actors. But let us focus for the present purpose, the responsibility or obligations of businesses. The first question is, do they have obligations or do they have merely moral responsibility? If you look at international soft standards in this field, UN guiding principles or the ILO tripartite declaration or OECD guidelines, these are the three main instruments, soft standards that we have. Businesses are regarded to have a soft responsibility, which is not legally binding. But in my personal view, businesses should have, and they do have, obligations which are legally binding under international human rights law, or they could be legally binding under domestic law. But I would like to make a distinction here. As we know, there is this tripartite framework of human rights in terms of duties, the duty to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. So whether businesses have obligations to respect, to protect, and fulfill human rights. And as I mentioned just now, UN guiding principles and other instruments say that businesses merely have a responsibility, and that responsibility is also limited to respecting human rights. They don't have a responsibility to protect human rights or fulfill human rights. But personally, I believe that, and I think David is on the call, I think he has also written about it. I personally believe that businesses have obligations not only to respect human rights, but also protect human rights. When it comes to fulfill human rights, I think perhaps I would argue that they have a responsibility to fulfill human rights, perhaps not a legally binding obligation, though in certain situations, the fulfill element could also be legally binding. And I could go to those situations if there is a time left later on. Now, what are the situations in which this obligation can arise? Now, if we adopt the UN guiding principles, there is this typology under principle 13 that if businesses cause, contribute to, or they're directly linked through their products or services to an abuse, then they have a responsibility. So if we adopt this typology of causing, contributing, or directly linked, which is used often in the context of supply chains, then I think we can see it in the context of gender-based violence as well. If businesses are causing gender-based violence, and I think in many situations you will find they are not causing it, but they may definitely contribute to it. And that contribution may arise because, let us say, the work environment that they have provided is not safe, and some third party is able to enter that workspace and commit this act of gender-based violence. So in my view, in those situations, the company should have an obligation in those particular situations because it has contributed by omitting to take adequate precaution in terms of providing a safe space for work. There have been, in fact, concrete cases. Let us say you have a call center, and that call center has provided a mode of transport to collect its employees from their homes or somewhere to the call center. And if during that process of commute, there has been an incident of gender-based violence, then the question is whether this company should have an obligation or a duty, and that duty has been breached because the violence took place. So in my view, those can be situations of contribution. The third possibility is that the business has not caused, business has not contributed to it, but it is directly linked to those particular situations. And as I mentioned, in the supply chain context, this could be very common. Let us say we have a garment sector context and or a mining context in which the workers have not been allowed to go home because the COVID virus can spread fast. And that's why the workers are not working 24 hours, but they cannot go home. So they're working in the factory and they're taking rest in the factory on the mining site. And then if there is a gender-based violence incident in those settings, and then the company which is sourcing any minerals from such a site, or a brand which is selling the clothes made by a company in such a factory, of garment factory, So those situations of direct linkage can arise. But I would like to add another element here, and that element is based on the last year ILO Convention 190. And Article 3 of this ILO Convention 190, this, as you may know, 190 Convention is dealing with harassment and violence at work. And Article 3 of this convention, this convention will come into force next year, this defines this term world of work very broadly. So the internet space, cyber space, or other settings in which you are communicating for work, that could also amount to work space. And if the worker is commuting, that will also amount. So I think this world of work is defined very broadly by Article 3 of this ILO 190. And I think that could be very much relevant in the context of gender-based violence that we're talking about. Now, let me finally talk about the response. What should businesses do in those particular situations? I think it is fairly well accepted now that businesses have a responsibility to conduct human rights due diligence, which is legally binding, excuse me, in certain countries, especially in Europe. And there is a treaty process going on that could make it potentially binding globally, or the European Union is considering mandatory human rights due diligence legislation going forward 2021. So if we have that as a binding framework within the European Union, then it will apply even to non-European companies operating within the European Union, or if they're part of the supply chain of the European companies. So this human rights due diligence should be done. And I think if companies would like to do it, they have to do it in a gender responsive manner. And here I would like to bring in a reference to a gender report that I wrote last year for the UN Working Group. And that report develops a gender guidance and a gender framework, and that has 3 components. The first step for any company or any government or any agency should be to do gender responsive assessment. And this assessment is not only about the impact of the decisions of the company that may take. It should also look at the legislation, the social and the economic structure within which the company operating. And I think that is the starting point. Once you find this, then you have to take some gender transformative measures. And I think this word transformative is quite crucial. It's not merely sensitive, it's not even responsive. It is gender transformative, because businesses are expected to really contribute to achieving substantive gender equality. And they cannot achieve this, and they cannot contribute to SDG 5 if they are not playing that transformative role in changing the power structures in their factories inside, or in society as well, I will argue. Because the power structures are even outside the workspace, and businesses should try to contribute to changing those power structures, patriarchal norms, social norms. They can do advocacy, they can raise awareness, they can build capacity, they can fund programs at universities to do that, you know. So I think that is something they should do. And the third element of the gender framework is gender transformative remedies. If there are abuses, and in the present context of this webinar, we are talking about gender-based violence. So if there are those incidents of gender-based violence, then the businesses should provide remedies. But here again, remedies should be transformative. They should go beyond fixing those particular cases. So if they find a particular pattern of violence, they should try to address those systemic issues, that why that violence has taken place and what can be done to prevent and preempt those violations in future. Now, in terms of, I think one issue that I have found quite lacking is that even if businesses would like to be gender responsive, the sensitivity of the staff is very low. So you have, let us say, a huge range of people working for a company at different levels. Some of them, let us say the leadership team, would say, oh, let us be gender responsive, let us create a diverse and inclusive space. But what does it mean? What is inclusive? What is diverse? And what is creating a safe space for women and girls, or even LGBTI people, right? So this sensitivity inside the business to change the corporate culture, because there could be a very masculine corporate culture in many companies. So unless businesses bring that sensitivity inside and change this masculine culture, they may have good policies and good intentions and frameworks, they may not be able to achieve much outcome in practice. And I think that is quite critical. My last point, and I will stop there, Mispa, is advocacy element. I think businesses do lobbying all the time with the government. But I will argue they also have a responsibility to do positive lobbying. And that positive lobbying could be that if there are discriminatory laws and policies, for instance, there are more than 50 countries which do not have any legislation even now dealing with sexual harassment, specifically at workplace. So businesses perhaps have a role to play in making advocacy, in lobbying the governments in those countries to change those inadequate legal frameworks or discriminatory legal frameworks. And I think that would create an environment which is conducive to a more equal society, both inside the workspace as well as outside. Thank you very much. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Deva. That was fascinating, and especially for me that don't really, businesses, I think about them as far as it goes, as far as my banking goes or going to the shop. So I'm definitely not a human rights lawyer as you and David from the business side. But I think as I was sitting here, especially your couple of last points, I think a lot of the responsibilities that businesses will have in general will depend on the type of business, the type of work that is done. I do think if it's, for example, in a professional a law firm or an investment bank, it's quite different to, let's say, the example that you used of the mining sector, etc. I would really, you made me think a lot, so I'm going to keep my questions for a little bit later, because I also think it relates quite a bit to the privacy of employees. And again, and it feeds into that stigma, and there's a certain professionalism that that a person can have at work. And now, because everything has become so mixed, I mean, there's hardly any private time, especially for people under hard lockdown. So it's very difficult to keep those two separate. So now I'm going to hand over to Bonnie. So I think, yeah, we have to keep our questions for the Q&A. But Bonnie, I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about the responsibilities of universities, and how far does it reach these responsibilities? Do they have responsibilities towards their students, towards their staff? And yeah, something that we haven't needed to think about until COVID-19. Thank you, Bonnie.
Sure, and thanks, and hello. There are a lot of familiar names. I'd love to say a lot of familiar faces, but a lot of familiar names on the webinar, and it's great to be engaging with you. And Surya, always a lot of fun to be on panels with you. So, and yes, you know, the majority of what you say, of course, I do agree with. I suppose let me start with one point of not necessarily difference, but an alternative view following on what Mispa has said. And that is the question of what is the type of obligation a business entity, and let's for the purposes of this discussion include universities, because for the most part, even though they are maybe funded by the state, for the most part, they tend to also have a profit-making component, right? The point that Mispa just raised is, well, what is the nature of the business? Would that determine, is the corollary of that a particular nature of an obligation? And I would argue that yes, it is. That where it's core to the business model, in certain circumstances, a corporation may in fact have a positive obligation to fulfill certain rights. So let me answer your question, Mispa. Does a university actually have an obligation to ensure that students and staff are safe from sexual harassment? They most definitely do. And that Surya mentioned ILO 90, and that has made it very, very clear that the state must ensure that there are positive obligations, or that the university takes positive step, or the workplace rather takes a positive step to ensure accountability, prevention and accountability for sexual and gender-based harassment at work. In South Africa, of course, this is absolutely categorically clear from our case law and from our governing legislation. The Constitutional Court has made it clear that, that a corporate entity or workplace has an obligation to both prevent, but then if it occurs, remedy and hold accountable perpetrators of sexual harassment in the workplace. What that means, though, is the trick, right? That's the question. And Surya has really looked at notions of prevention and advocacy. So maybe what I will look at are some of the proposals around accountability, some of the deficiencies around accountability and responding to these forms of harm. But before I do, I just want to respond to a couple of points. The first is that the problem of domestic violence, Surya, you're 100%, it's exacerbated in many ways by COVID, for all the reasons that you, Mispa, Nancy, have mentioned. But I would also like to add that there's been some incredible innovation around domestic violence. So, for example, there's the now very well known but supposedly secret request at pharmacies that women can make for the COVID-19, for the mask 19, which is a code for I'm in a domestic violence situation, I need help. And it's amazing what actually can be achieved in a time of crisis. In addition, certain countries have cooperated with hotels that are now, of course, well, up until recently, were of course empty and struggling for business. And they've arranged with hotels that victims of gender-based violence can actually go to their hotels to escape violent situations and then to be in safe quarantined environments. And I wrote a piece about this a few months ago in which I said, why does it take a disease, a disastrous disease, a plague, to kickstart us into this kind of creative and imaginative response to the historical social ills? Surya, and once again, I agree with you that they've always been there, but there's something about the disease that has put them all into stark relief. And my response to those positive innovations is, are we going to stop them after COVID? Because I don't think we should. So, for example, in South Africa, we have a constitution that imposes obligations on corporations to respect human rights, and whether those obligations include positive or only negative duties is a much larger conversation. I argue that it does include positive obligations. But could we not wonder about the role of hotels in providing space for victims and survivors of gender-based violence during not only COVID periods, but periods in general? But let me move now to this notion of universities and places of higher education. And in some ways, the lockdown and reduction of people in the physical workspace has had a positive effect, right? Because you're actually not in a workspace where you are vulnerable to physical attack. But of course, that's not what sexual harassment in the workplace is, or sexual harassment in the university. It's only one component. The harm of emotional, psychological, financial, and sexual harassment that is non-physical is often as dire as the physical manifestation of sexual harassment. Let me give you an example. In 2013, when I ran the inquiry together with some other very wonderful people into systemic sexual harassment at Wits University, which was a dreadful process, a heart-rending process, 9 months of listening to people's stories of how, as academics, as members of support staff, and as students, had experienced the most egregious and debilitating form of violence on the part of particularly male academics, but also male students. And I want to share with you some of those stories, because they evidence not only what the harm is, but also what the lack of accountability means for the perpetuation of that harm. One young woman was a Black South African woman who had grown up in a particularly indigent circumstance, and she had made her way against all odds to university to study mathematics. Now, mathematics has a notoriously low representation of anyone other than white men, and that is not to say this is still the case, but it's an historical fact. Let's press pause for a second on that, because I just want to talk about quickly the assumption that so many people still make that there's something biological about this predominance of men in mathematics over women. The former president of Harvard University, President Summers, in 2005, so we're not talking about the 1970s or 1960s, 2005, provocatively presented an argument about why there are so few women in the maths and sciences, so-called hard sciences. And his argument, he presented three reasons for it, but one of those reasons, he said, is because the nature of math, science, engineering are such that it draws on particular biological characteristics or components that has less to do with social structures and more to do with biology. In other words, what he was saying is, because you are born with certain sex organs, you are in fact less likely to be able to achieve in maths and science. In other words, women can't do maths and science. Of course, there was a huge uproar about that. In fact, he was fired, if I recall correctly, or encouraged to step down as the president of Harvard. But we still labor under the presumption, under this continual bias, that there's something inherently weaker about women, something inherently less logical. And we see all these stereotypical quasi-Aryan tropes around women being irrational, about women being less logical and therefore less capable of so-called logical sciences. This woman had made her way through that barrage of barriers. She had found her way into a master's degree, an honors degree in mathematics at Wits University, an incredibly difficult program to complete. And she wanted to go on to do her master's. Mispa, how am I doing for time? Terrible. We'll just give me a 5 minutes heads up that I'm
terrible, Chair, because I'm listening to it's so fascinating.
Okay. Then I've got a couple of hours.
It's still fine. It's 2:45, so it's still fine.
So she identified her area of master's, area of study that she wanted to do in her master's was a very specialized area of mathematics. And there was one person at Wits University who she felt was directly able to address her area that she wanted to develop. There was nobody else. And he was and is a doyen of mathematics in South Africa and is well renowned for this particular niche area. So she went to a talk that he gave and afterwards went to him and said, look, this is my situation. I'm finishing my honors and I would like you to supervise me for my master's degree. He said, sure, well, let's discuss this. Come to my office. I'm very busy. Come to my office tomorrow night at 6 o'clock. And there was an immediate sort of hesitation. But she went to the office the next evening at 6 o'clock because it was obviously the only time he could meet. And he welcomed her into his office. He got up and he closed the door. And he came back and sat down. Now, when this young woman came to see me as part of this inquiry, she opened with the following phrase, Bonnie, I am not sure, and I don't think that what happened to me was sexual harassment, but I'm going to tell you the story in any event. So what was the story? As she started to describe the area of work she had been engaging and how she wanted to progress that area of work, the professor stopped her, held up his hand and said, you know what, let's talk about you for a little bit. Do you have a boyfriend? And she said, well, I'm not sure how that's relevant. What I really want to tell you about is my proposal. I said, no, I really want to know because it'll help me understand if I can direct you. It'll help me understand where you're coming from. Okay, she said, well, yes, I do. And so what I want to do in my research, and he said, no, hang on a second, is he black or white? The conversation progressed around, from his point of view, that she should in fact only engage in sexual relations with black men such as himself and that he would offer to supervise on the basis that they would have that engagement. I'm giving you a very summarized version of that discussion. But here's what happened to this woman. In that moment, her entire aspiration to become a mathematics academic eviscerated, came to an end, because this man was not going to supervise her. And she knew that by turning him down, he would ensure that she never made it into the master's degree. So the entire lifespan of this woman's career came to a staggering halt. What made it worse is, an hour into this meeting where she was trying to navigate and tap dance around this barrage of harassment, the professor's wife walked in, looked at her and said, "Oh, are you one of his sluts?" She left the university and left mathematics. So the harm of gender-based violence, and he never touched her, right? This is the point I want to make. He never touched her. And the harm was not only to this individual who didn't know that she could categorize what had happened as gender-based violence, as sexual harassment. The harm was not only to her, but to the entire aspiration of transformation in mathematics and in that academic component. Surya, you spoke about this need to transform culture. And this is exactly it. The handful, and well, not even handful, at the time there were 2 female academics in the entire mathematics department, and they also came and spoke about sexual harassment and the fact that they really weren't able to advance in that sector. And so what you're doing as a result of this harm is creating an exclusive club for men only, for the most part white men, that ensures women will never be able to participate in mathematics. So is it because of some essentialized biological component that women aren't in mathematics? Well, of course, the story indicates the contrary, even if you were to have such antiquated views. So what do we do about accountability, which is the second component of what I want to discuss? The bugbear that I have with gender-based violence is not around prevention, and it's not around socialization, because I believe in those, and that must happen, and it has to happen. But my concern is around the lack of accountability when it does happen. So let's take another example, and this is an example that came to my attention in the workplace in a matter in which I was involved. So this is not a university situation, but I think it helps reveal the problem I'm going to discuss. This occurred where a young woman had graduated with honors cum laude from her degree, and she was entering into the workplace in financial services. She was brilliant. She was a scholarship student and was ready to take on the world. She progressed in this organization but felt that there was a glass ceiling and never actually made an equity partner, so she moved after 5 years to another company. And she was sitting in this company one day with her manager and they were sitting at the desk together going over some finances, and he turned around to her, placed his hand on her leg and said, "It is such an honor working with you, but she's like, I am so distracted because you're just so beautiful. And I really think that we should take this relationship beyond the workplace." And again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to take you through the details of this case. But here was the problem she faced. She could go to human resources and ask for assistance, because of course it is against company policy. Of course, it's a major company with sexual harassment laws and policies. But what is she going to say? One of the most senior persons in this organization, in this company, has put his hand on my leg. Let's assume that the head of human resources, the relevant person, actually understands what that means and that that does fall into sexual harassment. Let us assume for a minute that she's even responsive to this person's sudden terror that this man is going to become physical with her against her wishes. Let us assume that the head of HR really feels comfortable with the policies and understands the psychosocial impact of sexual harassment. Is it really in this woman's interests to take a case where a fraction of sexual harassment cases are ever successful in excluding perpetrators from the workplace? In this particular instance, she did pursue it. The result was that before final disciplinary hearing could take place, this man left and is still working in the sector, but in a different country. And since then, which was about 3 years ago, she has not been able to find a job in the sector at all. She's been blackballed. I failed to mention she also has a Harvard degree. So this is the type of harm we experience with no accountability. So if you are a victim of sexual harassment in the workplace, you've got all the signs that say to you, keep quiet, rather resign, as 50% of victims of sexual harassment land up doing, or deal with the harassment. And a few years ago, there was a major movement, some of you may know about it, called following the fees must fall and the roads must fall. There was a movement around Rhodes students and rape. And a series of Rhodes women, a group of Rhodes women, started to take a position against the university for their failure to actually address rape. And this was not the first time there had been protests. The protest started when a group of women put up posters around the university with quotes that women who were victims of gender-based violence had received when they went to the authorities to report it. Things like, do you really want to derail this person's academic career? Do you know that you were partly responsible for it? Yes, but you were drunk. So a whole range of quotations and responses from the university authorities that really demonstrated to women that there was no accountability. The university responded immediately by taking down the posters. They took them down. So the very silencing that the students were objecting to was in fact confirmed by the university. What followed was a series of protests that resulted in the release of a list. Interestingly, that list contained a series of 11 names. 11 names. The press reported that this was a list of people who had been accused of sexual and of gender-based violence, and particularly rape, that this was a list. But that was the wrong reporting. The list, in fact, did not contain a single reference to gender-based violence or rape. It was simply a list of names. Everybody knew, though, that these guys had been accused of rape. Nobody had released a list of names saying that they had been accused of rape. But there was a backlash to this, with the result that some men were kidnapped or so-called abducted, if that was true, from their residences and kept overnight until they could be taken to the police station the next morning. The upshot of all of this was that not a single man was excluded from the university, and two of the leading protesters, who were never proved to have been involved in the abduction at all, were excluded for life from Rhodes University, together with a statement on their records that they had been excluded for kidnapping, violence, and harassment, which effectively means that they could never get into any other university, and they were not allowed to use any of their credits in further degrees from Rhodes. The institution had stopped their education in their tracks. By the way, at that time, there had never been a sentence by Rhodes University against a man who had been accused of rape for more than 10 years. One of them was for 5 years. One of them was for a year, where he was also asked to pay medical security. So you see here that both, and this hasn't changed during COVID, right? During COVID, that kind of harassment continues. It has a different form, and it is, but because of this allowance of interaction online, there's a certain liberality that comes with that, a certain informality that comes with that, that has in many ways accentuated the opportunities for universities, for sexual harassment in universities and businesses. But my concluding comment is that there is no question about the legal obligations of universities in South Africa. This, of course, has also been mirrored in the United States, where there's very clear obligations and some recent case law that has augmented the obligations of universities considerably to ensure, and the workplace in general, to ensure that sexual harassment is properly addressed. But until there are some fundamental changes in procedure, that level of accountability is not going to be overcome. And I want to leave you with one idea. I was working on a case recently where a man had been accused of sexual harassment over a period of 5 years, and the managers came to me of this. It was a major international corporation. They came to me and they said, do you think there's a case here? The problem is none of the complainants want to be witnesses. And I said to them, but why do you need complainants? Why do you need victims? Because you yourselves have knowledge of sexual harassment over 5 years. You yourselves have engaged with them over a period of 5 years. You bring the complaint. You act as witnesses. And yes, of course, it's indirect evidence, but isn't it better than no evidence? And the man was dismissed. So let me stop there. If you want any more ideas, I'd be happy to give them.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. Both your papers, that was excellent. I also got a couple of ideas, and also I'm going to abuse my position as chair a little bit and ask both of you questions before I hand over. Surya, what you said, it's actually both of you, that these, and we know, especially also in South Africa, but worldwide, sexual and gender-based violence already has unacceptably high numbers. So it's something that existed pre-COVID-19. So it's not something that is now all of a sudden new, but it's worsened. It's made, or not worsened, I wouldn't go that far, but it's COVID has changed it in a way. So certain challenges that there has been throughout, so denial thereof, but I'm thinking definitely silence that you mentioned, Bonnie, the silence thereof. There's, and I think also the link between both of you, what you said, Surya, about the due diligence obligations, and perhaps something that David also just mentioned to me briefly is with whether or not your businesses, whether it includes universities or whatever, that they perhaps have a responsibility to then also reach out to employees, to students, etc., and to find out, is there anything that we can do to have a safe place? So my question to Surya in particular, what you also said about your example of the mining sector or the clothing manufacturing, and then also certain places that has a very high, or that's very male dominated, or where there's still a very high culture of patriarchy. I think the pandemic has made that even more, it highlights it more, it brings it more to the fore, because if it's let's say there's one woman in a team of 50 or 49 men, the chances that she will speak up or will feel safe enough, it's quite different in an environment where you've got, where it is transformed, for example. So what are the different responsibilities that you can say, that you can draw from that? So the bosses and everyone know, or the management executive, they know sexual and gender-based violence takes place. They must be able to recognize this is patriarchal, this is male-dominated, what can we do? Should we be the first ones to initiate it, and to recognize almost that this is the situation? So that's my question to Surya. I hope it makes sense. And to Bonnie, I really like your idea of hotels. So the private sector, this is what hotels can do to be almost a safe house. And I'm thinking on campuses, residents, So the residences mostly, I know definitely at University of Johannesburg, most of the residences were evacuated right at the start of the pandemic. But so there's lots of empty spaces, right? Can't they use that to provide safe houses? And then also, what type of other, we need ideas for the type of responses. What type of responses can we have? Hotlines, you know, because also for both of you, what we need to keep in mind, I mentioned it also earlier, you have to, so this is a new challenge that you have to take into account with the silence, whether or not people will actually reach out to their employer and say, this is what's happening to me. Because there is that added thing of this is now, I'm almost taking off my mask and I'm showing my vulnerability. So it's a different type of response. So yeah, ideas around that. So I'm going to unmute both of you and then I will open up the floor. Or Surya, do you want to go first? Or Bonnie, do you want to go first? Do you want to just wave your hand which one wants to?
Let Bonnie go first, yeah.
And she's pointing at you.
Oh. Okay. No, I'm happy to go first, but I thought Benny should have a first go because
Sure.
I started first, so I think it will balance it out.
Okay. All right. I'll post a link to the article that I wrote on this that has some of those ideas. It's an op-ed. It's a short, relatively short, I'm sure, mostly uninteresting article, but there will be some answer to some of those questions. What are some of the key components or characteristics, the defining characteristics of domestic violence in particular? One of them is that it is systemic, in that it's allowed and normalized by the lack of sophisticated and meaningful responses from society, from the police. And I think it's very, hopefully obvious to all of us that very seldom are women able to truly protect themselves through the justice system from domestic violence. And if people would like to know more about that, I'm happy to chat more about the reasons for that. Another definitional characteristic of domestic violence is the notion of imprisonment. And for many of us who are experiencing COVID imprisonment and lockdown, we're experiencing, in some respects, obviously not in all respects, in some respects the equivalent of women who are in a captive situation. And I'm not talking about only a physically captive situation, although that certainly occurs. But I'm talking about a captive situation in which there are no choices. I cannot leave, says many, many women, because I have no financial security or because I have nowhere to go. You can't go to a shelter if you have a teenage son. Most shelters won't take teenage men and boys for very obvious reasons, but then where do you go? In South Africa, there's one shelter that will allow you to come with your teenage son. The reality is that the entrapment needs a response that is about a physical space. And so you're absolutely right, Mispa, about the hotels, the residences, and I just don't understand why we haven't done that before. Most of the safe houses for victims and survivors of domestic violence around the world are funded privately and run privately. Some of them may receive funding from government, but on the whole, governments do not provide these sophisticated and intelligent responses to domestic violence. And the idea of a hotline, absolutely, it's seminal, completely agree. But a hotline without a response is nugatory and deficient. In my view, you need the same type of response that you would have for organized crime. Is there a safe space that you can get to? You may very well need your details to be completely changed. The reality is that this type of violence will almost always be exacerbated at the moment when the victim goes to a public authority for help. That's at that and when she falls pregnant. Those are the two instances often where there's an escalation in violence. So you need to know that the minute you are going to go and ask for assistance from a public authority, that you do so with a backup. In the 20 odd years of doing this, I've never ever said to a woman, go straight to the police. I've said, make sure you have enough money saved, make sure you have a bag packed, make sure that you've got a relative you can go to or a friend you can go to, and then go to the police. And that's assuming the police will be helpful and responsive. So hotlines, places of safety that are decent places of safety, where you can still access work, where your records can be kept confidential, and where the dockets that often are opened in criminal cases aren't lost. And so yes, I think the response my response is you need a very clear set of imaginative responses. But another major component of this is also what happens when you get to court. So at the moment, if you go to court to get a protection order worldwide, you walk in the same door as the perpetrator, who has done any number of things to you and potentially to your children. You must walk into that courtroom, and while waiting for the court, which is always the case, you must sit opposite him, where he will look at you and intimidate you. And you will know that there's a very good chance that you'll walk out of that courtroom without a finding in your favor. And if that happens, you know he will be able to come after you. And even if there is a finding in his favor, in your favor, you will know that after 2 to 3 years, he'll be out and come after you. And then what do? Well, you walk away and you try and find a life that's safe. So what we really should be doing is rethinking how courts are actually structured and set up. What kind of law, what kind of evidentiary requirements do we have in context of gender-based violence? Is it actually acceptable to have single witness testimony be sufficient in cases of gender-based violence, because we have a context in which we know the statistics of gender-based violence? And what is the statistic I want to leave you with? The statistic I want to leave you with is that gender-based violence and domestic violence, particularly by intimate partners, causes more death and disability worldwide amongst women between the ages of 18 and 40 than HIV, malaria, than cancer, malaria, and tuberculosis combined. So you have a staggering health crisis that is akin to the COVID plague. And look at what the reaction has been to COVID versus the reaction that we've had to this other health pandemic.
Thank you, Bonnie. That was excellent. So I will build on what Bonnie mentioned, and Mispa will add a couple of more points in terms of the responses. So I mean, the masculine or male-dominated workplaces, both in the private sector or the public sector, is very much still the predominant reality, unfortunately. What can be done to change it? I think number of things, in addition to what Bonnie mentioned, and I agree with those. First of all, gender issues, whether these are about gender-based violence or other kinds of discrimination, but not violence, they are not on the top shelf of companies. Companies are grappling with so many issues. So what I often find is that no company or no family or no government can deal with all the issues at once. You have 20 issues and then you pick up, okay, these are the 4 out of 20 I want to start dealing with. And I think to bring gender issues on the top shelf is the first step, which is very, very critical. And I think the issue here is that why should they be on the top shelf? There are a number of reasons. So the issues about equality, human dignity. But I think one fundamental issue is that if they are not going to come to the top shelf, women will never be able to be integrated into our life, public life, private life, because it creates this atmosphere of fear. So whether it is the science, but forget about the STEM field. Let us take the legal profession. at the law schools in Hong Kong, Bonnie and David can give examples from South Africa. The law schools in Hong Kong, about 50% of the law students, or more than 50, are female. How many of them are barristers? How many of them are judges? So where do they disappear? So I think there's a huge amount of those patriarchal values throughout the systems. And I think because we don't understand the issues, Bonnie was giving some examples from the university setting, but it is not uncommon. So if you want to intern with a barrister, it is not uncommon for these young graduates to wear very, very short skirt, because the size of the skirt is anecdotally a relevant factor, whether a girl is going to get internship in chambers or not. So that's how those male-dominated cultures are perpetuated. And I think we need to change those. How do you do that? I think businesses need to consult with women organizations, and gender experts. Because sometimes, let us say, there could be a good intention, but you don't know how to do it. So you need to rely on either internal expertise or external expertise to change and get some suggestions, and the innovations that Bonnie mentioned would also be relevant in that particular context. The other issue is that we felt when I was doing this report last year and we did consultations in different parts of the world, we felt that even trade unions, who should be protecting the rights of the workers, including women, are very, very patriarchal. So how could we create gender responsive leadership in trade unions and workers' organizations who will consider women issues equally relevant, if not more relevant, as the issues affecting male workers in companies? So I think that is another element which is quite relevant. My next point, and last for now, is Bonnie mentioned about the accountability and the safe space to complain in terms of how the structures of the judicial processes must be changed. But equally critical is the non-judicial grievance mechanism, because there is a huge imbalance of power. Because often what is happening is women may not go to the court because they know they are going to face an uphill battle. So there is this temptation to settle this case, and there could be these non-disclosure agreements. We give you X dollars, you sign this piece of paper, you don't complain anything. This is justice. So I think we need to fix these imbalances of power, or this idea of so-called cheap justice or fast justice, which is not in line with the due process as well, through non-judicial grievance mechanisms, whether these are administered by the companies or universities. I mean, there are tons of cases involving universities where universities, even a famous, very famous philosopher, who I will not name, but Bonnie would regard, and a very Ivy League university in the US, they signed this document for a couple of $100 with this victim. Unbelievable. So I think this kind of the idea of justice with non-judicial mechanism, this has to be changed as well. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you. Then I'll just turn to some of the questions that were posted in the chat box there. The one from, firstly, the one from Abraham. Let me just get Nguni, founder and CEO of Positive Flame, South Africa. So there's, to summarize, it's regarding the increase of reported GBV cases, particularly in the Johannesburg, Gauteng area. So if I understand it correctly, that because we already have such high rates of GBV, not only in South Africa, but worldwide, is this something that government should have foreseen, that they should have already started taking steps? And can we say that there's an obligation that this creates for businesses to then step in for government's failure? Can we then say that there is this obligation then imposed on businesses, including universities, because governments didn't see that? Should we then say, no, you should have seen this coming? And then David Bulchitz had an interesting question also about whether or not, in worst case scenarios where there is definitely, a person could be left indigent or they don't have a proper place of work, can we say that there's a positive duty placed on the business to provide an alternative workspace or perhaps even housing?
Should I answer that question? Mispa, is this for me?
The first one, or both of you actually, you can each if
Okay.
you want to make a comment on that. Yeah.
So Bonnie, should I go first? Okay. So I'll be very briefly respond to both these questions. I think it is not either or. So if the governments, should the governments have foreseen it? Yes, they should have. But they'll also lack the gender responsive policies and not adequate gender impact assessment. I don't think many governments are thinking of gender impact assessment of the lockdown. That is not on the top of their mind. So I think going forward, this is a lesson. At the same time, I don't think that we can use businesses to pass off the burden of the government obligations. I think their obligations are independent and concurrent. So businesses have their own independent responsibility and obligations in many situations to respect human rights and prevent gender-based violence. And at the same time, governments must also play their part. It is not either or, that the governments pass it off to the companies or businesses, say, oh, let the governments do it. In relation to the question posed by David, I think, David, there is no answer like that you can give a uniform advice to each company in those situations. So the advice for each company in terms of what support and how should the company respond has to be tailored based on the number of employees, female employees that particular company has. Is it possible whether the company has the resources, let us say, to provide alternative accommodation? But here the dynamic way could be if the hotels are empty, as Bonnie was talking about this innovation, then there could potentially be a collaboration between this company and the hotel company. And the hotel can provide rooms at a subsidy that might help even this company, which may not have adequate resources. Helpline is a good idea, but then resources would be needed to manage that helpline 24 hours. Then there will be linguistic issues, whether it is available in all the prominent local languages and what counseling services are available and what effective, because sometimes helplines results in more frustration if you don't do them well. So merely creating a symbolic helpline may in fact backfire if it is not really helping positively the victims or potential victims of gender-based violence. So I think there is no one-size-fit advice, David, but yes, in those situations, whenever a company is telling employees to work from home, it must do a gender impact assessment and then take some proactive measures and then take it from there, and then continuously get feedback from its employees, talk to gender experts and see how it can tweak its responses as it goes. I'll stop here. Thank you.
You know, the question of foreseeing this, I can only echo what Surya said. Gender-based violence is always the last thing that is considered when a crisis hits. If you look at civil wars, not even civil, just conflict, if you look at environmental disasters, if you look at disease, it's always the last thing. And it's fascinating because everybody then scurries in later and creates a brouhaha around gender-based violence. We've got to do something about it. But the truth is that, as Surya said, it's not top shelf issues in government policies as well. And our government forgot about it. It remembered it about 2 or 3 days after announcing the lockdown, but they forgot about it. And so it's always the last consideration. And I must say, I get very angry still about the fact that we have all of these calls to end and eliminate gender-based violence and to celebrate Women's Day, because it really is a complete contradiction when you take into account action. Think about a company which is faced with a massive financial fraud. You're not going to call me or a human rights lawyer in to deal with financial fraud. You're going to call in your auditors, you're going to call in your forensic specialists, you're going to call in lawyers who have the expertise in financial fraud. You're going to make sure that you complete opposite with gender-based violence. Complete opposite. You leave it to an HR person, a human resources person, more often than not has no training than that, where there's a conflation of policies between the employee relations and human resources, where disciplinary procedures are designed as one size fits all, and where you get no specialization in, and then you wonder why it hasn't worked. So I think foreseeing issues, putting enough money around them and into them is seminal. As regards David's question, I think that there is a positive obligation on companies, and I don't think it's about stepping in when government fails. Should companies step in when government fails? Certainly in South Africa, I would argue there's a constitutional obligation to do so where a crisis arises and a corporation has control and the ability to address it, not just in general. But you're talking about a workplace that, never mind whether or not there's a legal obligation, which clearly from the governing legislation, from the Constitution and from case law, certainly imposes a positive obligation on companies to root out and prevent and then address sexual harassment. But companies themselves make that statement. They make the claim. They say, we are about transformation. They say, we hold ourselves to standards of equality. Now, if you as a company go out and make a statement like that, you've made a legal undertaking. And we don't see it in that way. We are so inclined to assume that this is some kind of amorphous reference to corporate social responsibility. It's not. It's a legal undertaking that you've made. So I would argue, yes, that all organizations in which there is an employment relationship, including in universities, that there is a positive obligation to do what you're supposed to do. And I see, I'll usurp your powers, Mispa, because I've just read this this question about should the university act if an employee is the perpetrator, but the victim has no association with the university. And we have in the past acted, yes, in those situations, not only a university, but an employer as well. Because if you say, I am a safe space for employees, and there is somebody who is accused of gender-based violence outside the organization, what makes me think that it won't be inside the organization as well? If a person is accused of murder in your employ, right, and you're going to put that person arguably on special leave. Why would you not do the same pending the investigation in respect of gender-based violence? I'll end there.
Thank you so much. I would also just like to hear your thoughts finally on whether you think there will be any type of improvement post-COVID-19 on for us to, relating to gender-based violence in any way, whether there will be a type of an improvement, because I think, I know, Bonnie, you said people think about it afterwards, but we are still in the midst of the pandemic. There's no end in sight. No one knows when will it end. So I think fortunately now already people are raising the alarm and saying there is a problem. instead of, I think, especially if I'm just thinking with armed conflict, how most often the response is only way after the armed conflict, and then when it starts being investigated. But I know the International Committee of the Red Cross, their argument is always, we assume sexual violence takes place during armed conflict unless it is proven otherwise. So do you think it's almost I need some hope from the two of you that perhaps we will learn something, and that, I don't know, what are your thoughts? Do you think we are learning something? What do you think the future will hold?
Thanks,
You first.
Mispa, and thanks, Bonnie, for giving me the marching order to go first. I will respect that. I may disappoint you, Mispa. I'm not very optimistic. Based on the past experiences that I have in the field of business and human rights, I think COVID is a crisis, and this crisis could be turned into an opportunity as we're talking about rebuild better. So we can definitely use this crisis as an opportunity to create a more equal society. And equal in the sense also the gender, substantive gender equality, but also equal in the sense of economic inequalities, redressing those. It is an opportunity to do that. So it should happen. It ought to happen. But will it happen? I'm less confident, because there are so many centers of power with their legitimate interests in mind, and they are likely to do lip service to these issues. That's my fear. It should change, but will it change? I'm less optimistic. Thank you.
Thanks, Surya. When I was writing my PhD on issues around gender-based violence and domestic violence, I had a really appalling moment for about a month, where I had been reading so much about this issue that spanned centuries. And I had this moment where I realized that as a species, we will never rid ourselves of gender-based violence. Never. It's, and it was a devastating moment, until I realized that, certainly as lawyers, but in society as a whole, perhaps our objective is not to end and eliminate gender-based violence, but to ensure that we have the appropriate structures and mechanisms of accountability to respond to it. And to be a society in which not only have we done away with, do we do away with legitimized slavery? I mean, obviously we haven't done away with slavery at all. But not only are we in a society that does away with political apartheid, of course, we still have economic apartheid in this country, but that we're a society that also creates structures to be responsive to and eliminate to gender-based violence in a way that makes it a meaningful response. What are our structures? I don't see it as a beginning and an end. This is a continuum. We always see a backlash. So Surya's report, in 2 years' time, there's going to be a massive backlash against it, because it's going to be questioned. You know, is it so important? What is the differentiation between women and men? When the guiding principles were first being discussed, and the Human Rights Council asked the United Nations Special Representative of Business and Human Rights, who was considering these guiding principles, to add a gender dimension, the response from his team to a lot of us was, if you have to deal with women, don't you also have to deal with other subgroups like minorities and children and indigenous persons? And, there's this real kind of backlash to that. And every 3 years, you can almost write it in your put it in your diary, every 3 years there's a backlash. We see it with #MeToo, there's been a backlash. But we've never had such a comprehensive response to gender as we do now, both internationally and nationally. And that's the hopefulness, that we continue to have infrastructural and systemic responses where the perpetuation of this violence, which I don't think will ever go away, is properly addressed such that there may be a reduction in it and a delegitimization of it. And that would be my response to your search for something positive.
Thank you very much. You both actually really, this was excellent. And you both, I know, Surya, you say you're not going to give me what I was looking for, but you actually did. Because yes, this is an opportunity. And Bonnie, as you said, this isn't going to go away, but neither must we then. So I really want to encourage everyone that, listen, yeah, this is an opportunity, and let us also not be silenced and keep on the good fights. Thank you very much, everyone. And Surya, Bonnie, David, Nancy, thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye and take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.